me first of all express my deep gratitude to you and GCII for partnering with us, and to my fellow panelists on the stage, High Commissioner Philip Green, Ambassador Nobrega, and Ambassador Shambhu Haki. Now, I've had the privilege of working with both Philip and Ambassador Nobrega long before they arrived in India and I arrived in India. So I have a long working relationship with both of them, and I'm very pleased now to also make acquaintance with Ambassador Haki. Let me also thank our Dean and fellow ambassadors that are here, and all of you for responding to our invitation. I thought it was important as we move towards the Johannesburg summit to have a moment to reflect on South Africa's presidency, to reflect on the G20 and the collective journey we have traveled thus far. Of course, for South Africa, this is a very proud and important moment, not just for the country, but I would say for the African continent. We last in line of G20 countries to host the summit. And I think also we've been very fortunate. We at the tail end of 4 G-South countries that have hosted the summit, starting with Indonesia in 2022, followed by India and Brazil last year, and then ourselves. I don't think it was by design. I think more by default that you have 4 countries of the Global South in the tail end of the first cycle of summit. But as we prepare for the Johannesburg summit, we need to take stock, because part of what South Africa will be delivering at the summit is a report on the G20 at 20, reflecting on the journey thus far and mapping out the road ahead. Now, let me say that I am in some sense a G20 junkie, because I've been very privileged to be part of the G20 journey, serving as South Africa's G20 Sherpa for several years. And I firmly believe that the G20, since its inception at the level of summit in 2008, when the first summit took place in Washington, D.C., has been a force for global good at a time when the international community needed a collective platform of the major countries of the Global South and North coming together under one umbrella to tackle our common challenges and problems and see how we can, in a collective and inclusive manner, apply ourselves. Now, if you look back to the financial crisis of 2008, which prompted the leaders of the world to elevate the G20 from a finance minister's track to a summit level meeting, between November 2008 and November 2010, we had 5 summits, starting with Washington and the 5th summit in Seoul, in between one in London, one in Pittsburgh, and one in Toronto. Now, that itself is a clear demonstration of how it is possible for leaders of the Global South and the Global North, irrespective of our respective positions in terms of global issues, that if we apply ourselves collectively and the political world that existed in those first 2 years and the positive development emanating out of these 5 summits that put back on track the global financial and economic crisis and set us on a path of working collectively together. And from 2011, when France hosted the G20, thereafter annually. Now, of course, the G20 came together, as we all know, initially to address the global fault lines in terms of the global economy and financial system. But over the years, of course, this agenda has expanded. Now, why did it expand, and why does it continue to expand? The G20, of course, was addressing a fault line that already started appearing within the global multilateral architecture. The G20 was not there to replace the multilateral system, but to reinforce it at a time when it needed reinforcement from the outside, given that a number of the founding member states of the United Nations started withdrawing energy from the United Nations and its various agencies and entities. So the G20 was tasked with this collective action to set us back on the right path, but not to undermine our multilateral institutions. Of course, there have been some criticism, but over the years, there has been an agenda creep on the G20 in terms of the agenda constantly expanding and taking over the mandate of some of our UN agencies. But as I've said, one has to see it within context. Now, if one looks at the journey we have traveled thus far, leading up to the end of the first cycle in South Africa, I believe that the G20 has made a positive contribution on a whole range of issues, addressing the economic challenges, the financial challenges, the social challenges, challenges around the environment and climate change. But already we started seeing some fault lines as early as 2014, when Russia was suspended from the G8. And when we met in St. Petersburg, I had the privilege of being there, when Russia was presiding of the G20, for the first time, a political issue was brought up to the table. You will recall that we had the Syrian crisis, and there was a decision by a certain number of countries to indulge in unilateral action against the Assad regime. And that was put on the table by President Putin. It wasn't part of the agenda. And for the first time, we had a major political issue being discussed within the G20. And of course, thereafter, you know the history in terms of the challenges that we continue to face. Now, I believe that the past four presidencies, including South Africa's, has been the most challenging in this cycle. I've seen and been part of the inner workings of the G20, how well we work together within the Sherpa track, within the finance track, and within the various ministerial tracks, that despite the distance on some of the critical issues, we were able to find common ground for global good in addressing these challenges. But when Indonesia, of course, took over the chairship in 2022, we had a major global issue that started impacting on the workings of the G20 in terms of the Russia-Ukraine situation. By the time India inherited that chairship, you had that situation that had become more to the fore, including the ruling by the ICC against President Putin that prevented him now from coming to the summit as a major G20 country. And then by the tail end of India's presidency, you had the Gaza situation. Brazil had to inherit all of these and maneuver through these. In the case of South Africa, we had all of this, and until recently, the Gaza situation, plus the second term of the Trump presidency that came with new challenges, all of which we are fully aware of. The weaponization of trade through tariffs has become a major issue impacting on all of us. Now, for the first time in the history of G20, when South Africa took over the chairship on the 1st of December last year, and we announced the theme of our presidency as well as our key priorities, you had a key G20 member totally disowning the theme and not supporting that theme. It's never happened in the past. So this created a new challenge for the presidency, where a country read differently the intention of the presidency when we stated that our theme is about equality, about solidarity, and about sustainability. Unfortunately, some read differently into these three terms that form the core of the theme. Now, as pointed out by Manish, the major focus of South Africa was not to reinvent the wheel. The G20 is not about each presidency coming there and starting anew. It builds on the previous presidencies, the successes we've had. And that is why the G20 is so coherent, that we have continuity, that what has been put on the table, be it under Australia's presidency or under Brazil's presidency or India's presidency, this is not wiped off the table. We continue to build on it and take it forward. and make sure that we deliver on these priorities. And I think, therefore, South Africa, some of the issues we have put on the table are not new issues. The issue of inclusive economic growth, that's something that has been on the G20 agenda since its inception. The issue of inequality, that's not a new global issue. The issue of unemployment, that is not new. So is the issue of industrialization. That was already on the G20 agenda during China's presidency of the BRICS, when they had industrialization of Africa and LDCs as one of the key priorities. Under the German presidency in 2016, we had a sharp focus on Africa. The Compact for Africa was adopted during the German presidency. So us also bringing sharp focus on Africa was building on the work already done by previous presidencies on some of these key issues. But of course, South Africa had the opportunity as the first African country to preside over the G20, to bring to the fore Africa's development and Africa's key challenges. And that is why, apart from the themes that we have outlined, including food security, which is a major priority for South Africa, it has been on the G20 agenda for quite some time. Of course, perhaps the so-called new issue on the G20 agenda in a focused way is the issue of AI, data governance, and using an innovation for sustainability. This is something perhaps in a focused way that appears for the first time on the G20 agenda. But as was alluded to by Manish, we also set up various task forces on focused priorities. We had a task force on food security, we had one on inequality, we had one on critical minerals, and one on disaster risk and resilience, which is also nothing new under India's presidency that received a lot of attention. Now, as was pointed out by Manish, President Ramaphosa appointed an extraordinary panel, G20 panel of experts looking at global inequality. That report was released last week, and Manish has quoted from there some of the statistics. And this addresses the issue of inclusive growth, as well as inequality, unemployment, as well as industrialization. That report, headed by Joseph Stiglitz, points out to the fact that since 2000 up to 2024, 80% of the countries globally have high levels of inequality. And the World Bank defines inequality as countries having a Gini coefficient above 0.4. And this represents 90% of the global population. Of course, the report does point out as well that between this period, 2000 to 2024, inequality has dropped. And that's largely because of the rapid rise of China. But globally, inequality is on the rise. The average Gini coefficient is 0.61. This report also points out that between this period under review, the wealthiest group, 1% of the global population, accumulated 41% of new wealth, while over half of the global population only benefited by 1% of new wealth. So this sharp focus of what is happening within countries in terms of inequality and between countries is something that the G20 has been seized with. With regard to food security, the report also points out that 1 in 4 persons in the world today suffer from moderate to severe food insecurity. That's a massive number of people. And between post-COVID, 335 million global citizens have been pushed into global poverty. So while there is new wealth and massive new wealth, it's in the hands of a very few. And again, that is why the sharp focus also for South Africa on Africa's development Because COVID pushed over 100 million Africans back into poverty. All the gains we made over the past 25 years were reversed as a result of COVID. So, our presidency of the G20 has brought sharp focus on the AU's Africa Agenda 2063. And we have immersed all of these programs within the work streams of Agenda 2063. Now, you will recall under Southeast presidency in 2020, one of the key outcomes was the G20 framework on debt sustainability. So we have brought back this into focus, and President Ramaphosa appointed a special panel under our former finance minister, Trevor Manuel, to look at debt sustainability in Africa. Although it's not a specific G20 task force, the work of that task force has fed into the finance stream of the G20. So these are all collective issues that forms the agenda of South Africa's presidency. I just want to put out some thoughts to you that all of us should be reflecting. In fact, just before coming here, I had a very fascinating meeting together with two of my colleagues, with Dr. Shashi Tharoor. He's going to South Africa next week to deliver the annual International Desmond Tutu Peace Lecture. And we had a very interesting discussion around the G20, around multilateralism and the future of the UN. Now, where do we go to after this first cycle with the G20? Given that more fractures are appearing on the global fault lines in terms of power dynamics. You would have seen that the USA had indicated that the Vice President Vance, will attend the summit and not President Trump. For the first time since summit started, the President of the USA will not be at the G20 summit. Nor will the Vice President, because he's now announced that no official from the USA will attend the summit. Of course, this is not new. President Lula opened COP30, and the USA is absent from one of the most critical and important meetings affecting all of us equally, no matter how rich or how poor a country we come from. They are absent from there. But my view is that the G20 is too big to fail. There is no one country that can collapse the G20. The United Nations have had a very turbulent past 2 decades, I would say, or more. But that continues because the rest of us believe in this organization, that is our organization, that we came together in 1945 to create as the only institution that can protect multilateralism, that can give all of us an equal voice, and where we can go and take our challenges and discuss our opportunities with collective. So we may have some challenges going forward as the G20, but I firmly believe that the G20 is a powerful force, the only platform, given the weaknesses of the global multilateral system, including the undermining of the United Nations and some of its entities by some, that the G20 provides this platform that's a staircase between the global north and the global south to work together. And we have done so successfully for the past 19 summits. I'm sure we will have a successful summit. I say this not from a biased point of view as South Africa, that we have worked hard despite us not being supported all the way in the issues we have put on the table. But I believe that there will be a substantive outcome. Whether there will be a declaration or not, I cannot say. If the G7 failed as like-minded countries to come out with a declaration at the summit in June this year, how much more difficult for us now, given that what I call is a return of a unipolar moment that we are experiencing in the world today. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for